Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Matthew chapter 23, we have the Lord going through some detail of showing how the Pharisees and the scribes had fallen short in their relationship with God, but also in their guidance of the people of God. And he gives quite a few examples of how it is that they've fallen short. And some of those are found in our reading today, starting in verse 16, where he says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by both the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." And so this is a very specific criticism that Jesus gives to the religious leaders, to the Pharisees and the scribes here. And that is that they were focused on the gold that was on the temple more than the temple itself when it came to oaths, and more focused on the offering than the altar that the offering was placed on in their oaths. And they'd say, well, if you swear by the temple, that's nothing, but if you swear by the gold of the temple, then you're obligated. Or if you swear by the altar, that's nothing, but if you swear by the offering that is on the altar, that is something. And it kind of brings out their whole approach to the spiritual life, and that they're so focused on the outward things instead of the true things, the things that really mattered. And Jesus is bringing that out in this, accusation against him. And Jesus is saying, what's more important, the gold that kind of overlays the temple, or the temple itself that sanctifies the gold? And also, what's more important, the offering that's on the altar, or the altar that sanctifies the offering? The gold by itself, before it was placed on the temple, was just ordinary gold. Who knows, maybe that gold had come from other objects. Maybe they were rings that people had, or earrings, or bracelets, or something, and was melted down into gold and was placed on the temple. Before it was placed on the temple, there was nothing special about the gold. What makes the gold special was that it was attached to the temple, the dwelling place of God that he goes on to mention. And then the same thing with the offering. Whatever offering that might be, if it was a goat or a lamb or a bull, it's just an animal out in the field before it was brought and presented as an offering to God. And so there was nothing extraordinary about that animal until it was placed on the altar. And in that way, the altar sanctified that animal as it became an offering to God. And so what we have here is kind of a principle of how holiness is transferred to various objects as they are connected to God's dwelling and the presence of God and the places of God's dwelling. And this becomes important for us as believers, because we have to understand too that our holiness doesn't come from ourselves. That is, positional holiness doesn't come from ourselves. It comes from our connection to God. Before we came to Christ, before we were placed in Christ, we were separated from God. And when we were separated from God, we were not holy. We were not sanctified. We were not set apart unto God. We were living after the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, engaged in the lust of the flesh and the mind. We were completely separated from God. But it wasn't until we were placed in Christ, who is the temple, in a sense, the embodiment of the temple, that is the representation of the presence of God, a manifestation of God, we were placed in him. And it's because of our connection with Christ that now we are holy. And this ought to do two things for us. One, it should humble us. It should say, you know what, where we stand before God and the holiness that we have is not because of anything that we are, in ourselves, but it's because of Christ, because his holiness is transferred to us as we are placed in him. So it should humble us. The second thing is that it should kind of sober us. It should cause us to pause a little bit and say, wait a minute, if I'm really connected to Christ, and if I have holiness being transferred to me from Christ through my connection with Christ, that ought to affect the way that I live and the way that I view myself and how I view situations that I'm in and how I engage in those situations. It should completely change my whole paradigm when it comes to life. It should cause me to look at life in a totally different way. To know that the way I used to live, I can't live that way anymore because now I'm connected to Christ. I now have the holiness of Christ, in a sense, transferred to me because I'm placed in Christ. And therefore, there is a calling to then live according to that holiness. And this is a high calling. We also read today in our reading in Exodus chapter 19 about the holiness of God when he appeared to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. It describes it this way. It says, when it was morning, there were thunder and lightning flashes. This is when the Lord appears on Mount Sinai. And a thick cloud upon the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And it says Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. Now, that's a holy God. That's a powerful and mighty and holy God. And that's the God that we're connected to through Christ. We're like the gold on the temple. We're like the offering on the altar. And being connected to these holy things, we ourselves become holy. But at the same time, there's a call for us to live up to that holiness with the help of God and with the strength that he supplies us. And as we trust in him and as we submit to him and as we are directed by him, we have this calling to have the positional holiness that we have lined up with the practical holiness that we display in our lives. So this little, criticism that by Jesus towards these religious leaders give us some very profound principles and things that we can learn from as we engage in our day-to-day spiritual lives. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.